Hi everyone, and welcome to this video, which is all about the history and background information that you need to know if you're studying Jane Harrison's amazing play, Rainbow's End. Now, at the beginning of every video in this series, I will have an acknowledgement of country, and this is really just to pay my respect to Aboriginal peoples all throughout the country, regardless of where you're watching this from. Just a heads up, I'll also be showing some historical images of Aboriginal people who have passed away, and I'll be using the terms Aboriginal peoples and Koori people throughout the presentation. Because I'll be touching on some historical legislation, I'll also be using the term Aborigine, and this isn't a term that we would use today. So I will acknowledge up front, this is going to be quite a long video. So I've broken it down into 4 chapters, that way you can move forward and back as needed. And this is a bit of an overview of what we'll be covering. So let's start with the purpose of the play and why it was actually written in the first place. So Rainbow's End was commissioned by the Ilbagiri Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Theatre Co-op. Their brief was that they wanted a playwright to write about the heroes in Aboriginal communities in the 1950s. Harrison chose to interpret this brief by writing about what she termed the unsung heroes in these communities, which she believed to be the women. The play is entirely fictional, but it does reference a lot of historical events, which is why it's really important that you understand that history before you study it. Now, I've made a brief timeline of some of the history that you need to know. By no means does it cover absolutely everything, but I hope that you find it helpful just to put the play in a bit of context. So if we begin here with colonization, we know that that brought disease, the frontier wars, really damaging policy, and we'll talk about some of that today, as well as a general attitude and belief of assimilation, that Aboriginal people needed to be saved, or they needed to be protected. They needed to assimilate into white culture because they saw that as being superior. So you can see that already from the outset, that attitude was really harmful. By 1883, in New South Wales, the Board for the Protection of Aborigines was created. And as part of this board's role was to dispossess Koori people of their land and to segregate them away from community onto what they called reserves. By 1888, Cummeragunja was a reserve that was established. And by 1890, the Bringing Them Home report, which was commissioned by the Australian government, that found that by 1890, there were Aboriginal children being removed from their homes under the guise of protection. By 1909, the Aborigines Protection Act meant that the government had even more power and even more control over Koori people, and in particular reserves, and we'll see the impact that that had a little bit later. By 1915, the amendment to the Aborigines Protection Act meant that the government really no longer had to justify the removal of children like they did before, and that they had even more power and control to be able to remove children. And this is what we now know as the stolen generation. By 1939, we have the Cummeragunja walk-off, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but you need to know that because the people who left Cummeragunja relocated to the flats, which is where Rainbow's End is set. By 1946, there are approximately 130 Koori people living on the flats, and by the time the play is set in 1954, we have approximately 300 Koori people living here. This is also the year that the Queen visited Australia. She visited Shepparton and went past the flats, but the flats were hidden from view. And you'll see this detailed in the play as well. By 1956, now we've had, I suppose, protest and resistance to policy and these attitudes by Aboriginal people all throughout this time. But by 1956, we have the Yarranangu people found to be really badly affected by nuclear testing. And I suppose this put the plight of Aboriginal people on a national platform. And for the first time, there was quite a lot of public outrage about the treatment of Aboriginal people. And this really started the movement for Aboriginal rights in Australia, which led to changes to the Constitution in 1967. So, like I said, I haven't included everything, but hopefully this gives you a bit of a timeline so you can understand where the place sits in history. So let's talk a little bit more about Cummeragunja, the Flats, and Rumbalara. So in 1883, we talked about that board establishing these designated plots of land for Aboriginal people called missions, reserves, and stations. Now, there's really not a whole lot of difference between those three. Essentially, missions were run and controlled by churches and missionaries. Stations and reserves were typically run by the government. Reserves typically had a little bit more freedom and flexibility than stations did, but all three were often very strict and harsh. And that's because the purpose of these was to segregate Aboriginal people, remove them from their land, and try and assimilate them into white culture. So for that reason, there were often managers, or what they termed protectors, put in charge of the Koori people living on the stations. They made sure that Aboriginal peoples didn't speak their own language, that they couldn't move freely, they couldn't interact freely, their food was controlled, their clothing allocations were controlled, they had limited access to employment, and the protectors even had a say in who they married. And I think the Bringing Them Home report really highlights some important, I suppose, recognition of these plots of land were designed under the guise of protection or somehow improving the lives of Aboriginal people. But I think it's important to recognise that the conditions on these settlements were horrific. And because they were underfunded, it meant that not only were they not protected, but they were more likely to die an early death. So Cummeragunja specifically, I've put a little map here so that you can see where it is. In 1883, we have Koori people relocated to reserves like Maloga Mission. This was a mission, so it was run by a religious group. The Koori people living on there at the time were really unhappy with this religious and authoritarian management. And so they actually commissioned the government at the time and said, look, if we have to live on a reserve, can we establish our own reserve called Cummeragunja? We would like for it to be a farm, and we'd like to be able to work, make our own money, and try and live self-sustainably. This went ahead, so the government said yes. However, they did put a manager in charge, and they had various managers who were all varying degrees of neglectful and abusive. So by 1894, we have a new manager put in place who is not perfect by any means, but he did oversee the subdivision of land, which meant that Koori people living there were given their own plot to run. There was also a Koori-led management group who oversaw the farming sales of wheat, wool and dairy, and all of the profits went back into the community. For that reason, the conditions on the reserves improved. Now, remember that we had that legislation in 1909 and again in 1915, which meant greater government control over Koori people. Now, this meant that they took greater control of reserves. They also forcibly removed more children. And as part of that legislation, all of the profits from reserves like Cummeragunja now went back to the board instead of back to Koori communities. And the lack of funding that was put back into community meant really poor conditions on reserves. This led to really terrible illness and a really large number of deaths. For that reason, the Koori people living on reserves at the time on Cummeragunja, they staged a mass protest or a strike, and this was called the Cummeragunja Walk-Off, where all the people living on Cummeragunja left in protest. Now, when they left, they relocated to an area called the Flats, and I've put a map of that below so that you can see where it is. The reason they chose the Flats is because of its close proximity to the river, and some Koori families were also living there already. Something that you need to know about the Flats, and this is also explored in the play, is that flooding occurred quite frequently. And so when this area would flood, the community would move kind of on higher ground to an area called Dacia's Paddock, which was an old rubbish tip. So what was life like on the Flats? Now, most people living on the Flats lived in tents or humpies, which are dwellings made from hessian cloth and bits of scrap metal. Now, we've already talked about how many people were living there, but what we have learned from community members who were living there at the time is that while the conditions were extremely poor, there was a sense that the community was able to continue their cultural heritage, that there was some degree of autonomy that they were able to have, and that for children living on the flats in particular, this was a somewhat happy time despite the struggles. Now, by 1954, the Queen toured Australia and she visited areas like Shepparton, and local authorities decided that they didn't want the Queen seeing the state of reserves like the flats, and so they hid this Koori community from her view with Hessian screens. And you'll see this detailed in the play as well, where Gladys is unable to go and see the Queen. Rumbalara is another setting that you need to know within the play, and this is a segregated housing development that was built by the government for Koori people, and it was built on that higher ground area called Dacias, which was the old town tip. Now, according to the inspector in the play, he says it is the government's most vigorous attempt yet to solve Aboriginal housing. So we still have that notion of Aboriginal people needing to be saved by the government. Now, within a decade of its being established, the residents campaigned for its closure. This is because of the terrible quality of housing and also the fact that it was still an area that was segregated from the rest of the community. Now, Rumbalara actually translates to End of the Rainbow, hence the play's title, and this draws on the legends of pots of gold being at the end of a rainbow. Now, we know that rainbows aren't literal or concrete, they're actually optical illusions, they're circular, they have no end, and this really symbolizes unattainable dreams. And as a metaphor, this is supposed to capture the improbability of a brighter future for Harrison's First Nations characters. Now, when they see the house at Rumbalara in the play, Nan ironically and bitterly references the New Deal, which is a 1939 piece of government legislation that improved housing conditions for Aboriginal people. Now, obviously, the play is set sometime later, so Nan says this quite bitterly to acknowledge that housing conditions never improved during this time. So let's now look more closely at the time the play is set in the 50s. What was Australia like? So we are post-World War II, and this is a time of post-war optimism and also a lot of prosperity. There's also a lot of immigration. However, it's important to consider that that is also a time where the White Australia policy is in full force. So really prioritising white immigration, and also emphasising that whoever came here, they needed to assimilate into a homogenous white Australian culture. This is also a time of the Cold War, so there's a real fear of communism. And within society, there's an attitude of conformity and of social conservatism. So really prioritising that nuclear family, that traditional family, and also really traditional gender roles. Interestingly, this is a time when most families started having a car, a TV, and with that brought pop culture as well. Now, what about attitudes towards Koori people in this time? Well, we know that the White Australia policy was in effect until the 1970s, and we have an attitude of paternalism towards Aboriginal people. So that idea of, they need protecting, they need saving by white people. We have the stolen generations taking place again up until the 1970s. There are a lot of discriminatory laws and policies in place, some of which we have already talked about. We have segregation in public places, not just segregating communities onto reserves, but also in a whole manner of public places. We have a lot of negative stereotypes being portrayed about Koori people in the media. We have racial violence and land dispossession. So a pretty horrific time for Koori people and Aboriginal peoples all throughout the country. Attitudes toward women this time, you can probably imagine given what we've already talked about in terms of traditional gender roles and social conservatism, but this is prior to the feminist movement of the 60s. So there is a very traditional notion that men are the breadwinners and that women need to stay at home and be wives and mothers. Really fun activity to do for this is to Google some advertising from the 50s, and I think that really captures attitudes quite well. I've included one here for you. And it's also important to recognise, and this is something to know before you read the play, that a lot of the Aboriginal children who were stolen from their homes, they were forced into employment. And for women, this looked like domestic service. Now, I wanted to acknowledge here that all throughout this time, there's a lot of resistance from Aboriginal people against policies, and that they didn't kind of just stand back and accept a lot of these things, and that all throughout this time in the 50s, they were demanding change. So I've included some examples here for you. So going back to Rainbow's End and where this all fits in, we know that the play occurs in 1954. That is, it's set in 1954. It's also set on the flats. And in Act 2 of the play, the people living in the flats moved to Rumbalara, or they're relocated to Rumbalara. Okay, so we've got the Deer family living in very poor conditions. There's also a sense of government surveillance and control, which is captured by Harrison, particularly through the character of the inspector and also through the police. We have a real paternalism and superiority captured by a lot of the white characters, especially in characters who are likeable even, like Errol. We also have gender roles captured even in the Deer family, with the men away working. Papa Deer is celebrated very publicly for his work for the community. Nan is a character who was raped by a white man, and she had her daughter Gladys taken away. She is educated and literate. However, given what she has gone through, and you can imagine, given that timeline I showed you before, she's very pessimistic of change and promises of improvements. She's very wary of the government and white people in general. Gladys, who is Nan's daughter, she was taken away as part of the stolen generation. She was forced into domestic service. So she is illiterate, she can't read and write. She has quite complex views about whiteness. I think she can see the benefits for her daughter in terms of trying to assimilate into white culture. And we see a real change in her throughout the play in that regard. She is very optimistic about the future, and she fights very actively for her community. Now, Dolly is really torn between her Nan and Gladys's attitudes. She has dreams for the future, but she also experiences a lot of racism and a lot of obstacles put in her way. So she's really torn between those dreams and reality, and she is eventually raped by one of the men living in her community at the time. I think a really great activity to try and understand these three women is to look at some of the historical events in the play, like the Queen's visiting, and really look at how each of the characters react to those historical events. The same can be said of how they respond to being told about Rumbalara. I think this can capture them really well. So I hope this was really helpful. Again, here's a bit of a summary of what we've covered. By no means do I think I'm an expert on this, but hopefully I've given you a little bit of background knowledge to understand the play better. If you have any questions, by all means, pop them in the comments below. Bye.